Combat is an essential part of any survival game, but Enshrouded infuses the experience with action and adventure game concepts that make the combat even more important. In this video, we're looking at every playstyle and sharing our pro tips for overcoming any obstacle. So for starters, let's level set. Myself, Livid, Schmo, and Nas, the entire Legacy team, has been playing Enshrouded a lot, and the team decided early on that we would each lean into a different combat style. Livid chose to focus on magic, Schmo on ranged, and I stuck with melee with Nas somewhere in the middle. The goal was to make sure we could deliver the best tips possible after experiencing the systems in their totality. Boy, did we learn a few things. You might know a lot of this, but never underestimate the power of a few pointers, because one of them might save your life and ultimately your time. For starters, I'd highly recommend you watch our best skills to get early video. Not only do we point out some mission critical skills like double jump, but we also walk you through each playstyle and highlight the best skills to consider. It's an important baseline and what we call the synergy between the combat and your character's progression, and it's essential to your success within the game. You also need to consider which armor matches your preferred playstyle. The blacksmith crafts melee armor, the hunter crafts ranged armor, and the alchemist crafts magic armor. As you unlock new items to craft, really pay attention to the buffs each piece brings to the table. There are no set bonuses in the game at the time of making this video, so mixing and matching is on the table if you're looking to build your character a certain way. So let's dive in with melee combat. This is my area of experience and the option I think most players will explore at some point during their time with Enshrouded. First, let's talk about weapon types and desired weapon buffs. At the most basic level, you have one-handed weapons and two-handed weapons. If you look at the item's tooltip, you'll see that a melee weapon has 3 standard damage types: cutting, piercing, and blunt. Enemies all have different resistances to these types of damage, so it's worthwhile having a combination of weapons with different damage types on hand. There's also the chance you could find a weapon with poison, fire, ice, shroud, or shock damage. These are elemental effects that further increase your damage capabilities. For example, this acid cleaver deals cutting and poison damage. When fighting enemies, you'll notice that with each hit, some scrolling combat text will appear, and that'll be your indication whether the attack you're using is effective or not. If you see the word effective, then some aspect of your weapon is dealing higher than average damage. If you see resisted, then some aspect of your weapon is dealing lower than average damage. Because weapons can have multiple damage types, as seen here with this Wailing Blade, a unique weapon we show you how to get in our early game gear guide, it can be tough to know exactly what type of damage is strong or weak, so you'll have to do some trial and error to really hone in on what's effective. With some of the number stuff out of the way, let's jump into the action. Here's the first thing you need to know about melee combat. Stamina is king, and the best way to get stamina is by having a rested buff. You can most easily get this by building a base and making sure you have some sort of furniture inside. This increases the comfort level, thus extending the rested buff. If you don't have the rested buff, don't go exploring. It's as simple as that. The amount of time you will waste having to wait for your stamina to recharge and the disadvantage you'll have in combat just isn't worth it. You'll also want to make sure you have the right food buffs for your playstyle. Not just any food buffs, but the right ones. If you're melee focused, then you'll need some cooked meat. This increases your constitution, which gives you plus 50 health per point. You'll also want food that increases your other supporting stats. Once you've unlocked the farmer, I recommend you start creating chamomile tea, which gives you passive health regeneration and increases your endurance by 2, giving you plus 20 to stamina. The other food I recommend early on is hazelnuts, which are easy to find in Revelwood. Just look for these trees here and you can grab a handful with each interaction. With each use, you'll get plus 3 to strength, which equates to plus 15 melee damage. So let's get down to brass tacks. Being a melee player means being up in the thick of the action, and the most important thing you need to know how to do is block and parry. Yes, it's a bit boring, but it certainly beats eating the dirt. Like with most parry systems, timing is everything, and Enshrouded does have a neat indicator for when you should parry. Most enemy attacks, not all, but most, will glow with a bit of an indication it's time to parry. This is a great way to get your bearing with the system, but after a few dozen reps, I have no doubt you'll be a parry machine and won't need the indication. With each successful parry, you'll add to the enemy's stun bar, seen here under their health bar. Once filled, the enemy will become overpowered and incapacitated, and if you spec into Merciless Attack, you can kill them that much quicker. I also want to point out that at any time an enemy is blocking, you should be laying in with attacks. The more you attack during a block, the more stun damage you do. A combination of parries and attacks during a block will ultimately net you the same result, an overpowered enemy, and that, my friends, is the single best way to kill any foe in the game. If you're not confident in your ability to parry, that's fine, just block. With a good shield, proper buffs, and the right equipment, mainly a melee-focused set of armor, you can essentially hold down the block button and not take any damage. If this is your preferred style, then it's a game of cat and mouse. Block incoming damage, then when the enemy is done, weave in your own offense, but don't get greedy. Land a few attacks and then bring the shield back up. This is the safest way to deal damage, especially against tougher enemies. If you're a more aggressive player, then things become more about dodging than anything else. Fighting enemies doesn't always require a roll. In fact, because Enshrouded's AI is, well, less than great, you can often just sidestep enemy attacks and keep wailing on them. You should take every opportunity, no matter your spec, to attack enemies from behind, because they will take more damage. This can be amplified further with some skills, but even at a base level, attacking from behind gives you a plus 10% damage increase. If you're playing solo, this is much harder to do, but it's almost impossible if you keep rolling away from enemies constantly. You'll learn which enemies you can and can't sidestep around, so again, it's a bit of trial and error, and that goes a long way. I also want to point out that there's nothing wrong with a stick and move strategy when it comes to melee combat, especially early on. Again, taking advantage of enemy AI is nothing new in games, and in the case of Enshrouded, forcing enemies to constantly relocate is a huge part of having some early game success. Not only does this give you a little breathing room when you need to heal or regain stamina, but it also resets the animation of the enemy, so they have to move and come to you before they can attack again. It's another game of cat and mouse, which is not unheard of when enemy AI isn't great. Let's slide over to ranged combat. This is the playstyle that Schmo spent the most time with, and truthfully, it's one of the most effective if you're accurate. At this point in the game's early access development, there's only one type of bow, but don't let that stop you from exploring this aspect of combat. First and foremost, we have to understand the stats that boost this playstyle. Dexterity is your primary damage enhancer, and for each point in that stat, you'll gain plus 5% range damage. You'll also want to focus on critical hit damage. Bows have the unique ability to headshot, or skill shot as it's called in the game. Most enemies have a weak point, usually the head, and if you manage to land your shots, then you'll deal more damage. Having higher crit damage means the times that you'll hit those weak points and crit will result in massive damage. Unlike melee weapons, the bow itself doesn't deal a specific type of damage, but depending on the rarity, they do have important bonuses. One of my favorite early game weapons is the Fell Commander bow, which when leveled up, has great bonuses that synergize perfectly with a full ranged build. That being said, when it comes to the type of damage you deal when using a ranged weapon, you'll need to look at arrows. At first, you'll be able to craft wooden arrows. These deal piercing damage, and they're nothing more than a sharpened stick. But once you unlock the Hunter NPC and more materials, you can create a wide array of projectiles. You'll notice that as your options expand, each arrow deals different types of damage. Most are piercing, but also some have cutting and even poison damage, depending on how far you've progressed. Eventually, you'll be able to make special arrows as well, which give you even more flexibility during combat and exploration. Ultimately, you're going to want the best arrows you can craft. That is a no-brainer, and my simple tip here is to make sure you never, and I repeat, never stop collecting twigs, because if you're a ranged player, you're going to need a ton of them. It's rare that a survival game requires you to continue collecting such a basic resource, even dozens of hours into the game, but here we are. As far as food is concerned, you're going to want anything that increases dexterity, such as the vegetable puree. This is unlocked once you've rescued the farmer NPC, have built the fireplace in your base, and looted a forest beet within Revelwood. Sounds complicated, but any old dexterity food will do. As always, you just want the best option possible. Remember, for every point in dexterity, you're gaining a 5% increase in range damage. Now, unfortunately, you can't stack dexterity buffs, which would be ideal, but the game doesn't allow you to do that. That being said, it's still worthwhile to increase your endurance and constitution. There's nothing wrong with having more HP and more stamina, even if those two things aren't a major factor in ranged gameplay. Now, with a solid foundation, it's time to get into the ranged action. Gameplay isn't that complicated. You just want to make sure you have the right buffs and a healthy supply of arrows. You can take talents like Eagle Eye if you want that extra zoom when you hold down the right mouse button, but I honestly don't find it necessary. The key during combat is identifying the weak spot on an enemy. Every enemy is different, and as a ranged focused player, your job is to deal the most damage possible, and that means exploiting the enemy's biggest weaknesses. You can deal backstab damage with ranged weapons, so if you're playing in a group, this is just as good as finding the weak spot. Just keep your head on a swivel. It's very possible that enemies will shift their attention to different members of the group, and that could mean you. My biggest tip, however, when it comes to ranged combat is to use the terrain to your advantage. There is so much verticality within Enshrouded that it's easy to jump onto a roof of a house or even some terrain elements and completely negate the threat of an enemy. From your perch, land a few well-placed range shots, and that's one less enemy you have to deal with. Don't be a hero. There is no reason to fight in melee if all of your skill points are in ranged trees, so run away, establish some distance between you and your enemies, and let the arrows fly. Finally, I want to talk about magic. It's an absolute blast to use and something Livid has been exploring for the majority of his time with the game. One of the coolest aspects of Enshrouded is that you can use wands, which act as standard weapons, as well as staves, which are more specialized. The combination is powerful and is enhanced drastically if you build around their strengths. Just like with melee and ranged weapons, you need to know how to build your character. In this case, intelligence is the most important stat as each point grants you plus 5% magic damage. Intelligence also synergizes with the various auras that magic users have access to via the skill tree. Something like Water Aura, which heals a group passively over time, is enhanced further the more points you have in intelligence. The same could be said for Radiant Aura, which damages all enemies within a radius. That damage is based on how many points you have in intelligence. A secondary stat you'll want to consider is Spirit, which increases your mana pool by 20 for each point. Sadly, this doesn't increase your mana regen, just your maximum mana, which is still decent. You also can't underestimate Constitution if you're building for magic. The armor you'll have access to is much less protective than that of, say, melee-focused players, so having more Constitution and thus a bigger health pool could save your life. As we discussed before, food is also a big factor here, and you do have a few extra options. Early on, you'll find these Azure Rasula scattered around the Revelwood. Cook them up and boom, plus 3 intelligence for 25 minutes. You'll also want to pick some Arolan flowers and then start growing them back at your base in a little garden. One flower will net you 10 seedlings, which you can plant and cultivate for a huge stockpile of spirit food. Once you reach the Nomad Highlands and you can collect eggs, you can make boiled eggs at the farmer, which gives you an insane plus 3 to stamina recharge, plus 3 to health regen, and plus 2 to mana recharge, all for 40 minutes. Now let's talk about weapons, because things are a bit different here in the magic world. First, you'll need a wand, and you'll want one that gives the best stats possible, that's a given. A good wand has high attack speed, high overcharge value, which dictates the percentage of your wand's attacks dealing random spikes of higher damage, and additional damage based on whatever element you're focusing on. Certain enemies are weak to fire, ice, shock, etc., and knowing which are weak to what and having the appropriate elemental wand ready to go is key to your success. For instance, the fuzzy bear enemies, the Vuka, are weak to fire. With a fire wand and the right fire-based skills, these melt in just a few hits. There are 2 skill nodes you should always take if you plan on using wands, and both are in the Battle Mage tree. Wand Master gives you a 30% chance to fire a second projectile. This means 30% of the time you'll be doing double damage. And there's Sting, which increases the wand's damage by 20% as long as you keep dealing repeated damage to a target. Wands for the most part keep you locked in place, but you can slowly sidestep while continuing to cast. You can also get around this by bunny hopping while attacking. This will cancel your wand animation almost entirely and allow you to move in any direction, either towards or away from threats. We do fully expect this to be patched, so it's also best to get comfortable with periodically dodge rolling or parrying enemies with a solid shield, which you can equip while using a wand. When a wand just won't cut it, you can pull out your staff. This is a powerful, mana-dependent weapon that pairs perfectly with the wand and magic-related skills. If you're planning on building out the ultimate mage, then consider these skills. Unity allows your wand attacks to have a 24% chance to recover 2 mana per hit. In a longer fight, this can seriously add up and give you a nearly infinite supply of mana. One of the big downsides of your staff is your slow cast time, but again, this can be mitigated by a whopping 50% via the quick charge skill, allowing you to cast more often. The staff also limits your mobility, but you can slowly sidestep, and while you can employ the same bunny hop technique as the wand, using it with the staff just isn't as effective. In our opinion, using a quick swap to pull out your staff and cast a spell is the best use scenario. Personally, we don't run around with the staff truly equipped, as we find it to be more situational. Unlike the wand, which has no mana or even stamina cost to use, the staff requires not only mana, but quote-unquote ammunition for each specific spell, at least early on. These can all be crafted at the Alchemist once you've unlocked him and the materials required to make the spell. The Alchemist can also craft eternal versions of these spells that cost a lot of resources, but allow your staff to have infinite charges of that specific spell, and there is one for each spell in the game. These eternal spells cost a bit more mana to cast, but they deal more damage, and you'll never have to worry about running out of charges again. Much like with range damage, your goal when dealing magic damage should be to keep a healthy distance between you and your enemies. Use the terrain to your advantage and avoid fighting in close proximity to the danger. Remember, you can easily change spells on the fly, and as we talked about before, enemies will have different weaknesses and resistances, so plan accordingly. You won't have access to eternal spells until much later in the game, but there is an early Alchemist quest which gives you access to Eternal Ice Bolt, which is a good place to start. So there you have it, some advice for each playstyle. Hopefully you can take what we said, apply it to your gameplay, and push deeper into the game. That being said, Enshrouded is tough, and if you want some more useful tips and tricks, check out this video here where we share even more from our time with the game. My name is Kodiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching, and play on.